We all know it's possible for a cold case to one day come back in a breakthrough, but how about one which hasn't been solved in over 40 years? My name's Adrian, and welcome back to Coffee House Crime. Today we're looking at the case of Sylvia Quayle, who was found in 1981 deceased in her home, and how 40 years later, the mystery behind her killer would finally be solved. Now in this case, we're not just looking at the what happened, but we're also looking at the how. And just a quick one, if true crime and mystery is your kind of thing, I post on this channel once or twice a week, so if you haven't yet, please consider making my day by subscribing to Coffee House Crime. Right then, here we go. The year is 1981, the season is summer. We're in Cherry Hills Village in Colorado, and at the time, the city was called home to over 5,000 residents. And one of those residents, her name was Sylvia Quayle. Not a lot is known about Sylvia, or at least nothing that I could find, but she was born on the 23rd of September 1946. She grew up with her mother and father, and she has a younger sister, Jo. Sylvia was described to light up the room whenever she walked in, and it was known that she loved her younger sister very much. The date was August 3rd, 1981. It had been a particularly hot day that Monday, with temperatures reaching almost 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Sylvia had finished work, and she was back home that night, relaxing with her feet up. She spoke to her younger sister just before 11 PM. Couldn't tell you what about, but everything was happy in the Quayle residence. The clock was ticking late in the evening though, and the two sisters, they had their own plans the following morning. So on that note, just after 11 PM, they both said goodnight to each other over the phone and headed on to bed. The next morning, Sylvia's father headed to the residence to pick her up for coffee. It was the usual morning habit they held together. When he arrived there though, his life turned upside down. He discovered her lifeless on the living room floor, and he called the police immediately. Authorities stated that at some point during the night between August the 3rd and 4th, she had been assaulted before being strangled. She had wounds consistent with that by a knife, and she was shot through the temple. And shortly after had succumbed to other injuries by an unknown suspect. Notes from law enforcement stated that the phone line to the property had been cut, and this suggested that the crime must have happened at least after 11 PM, after she'd finished talking to her sister. Notes also highlighted that the bug screen covering the window to Sylvia's bathroom had been ripped off of its hinges and put in a nearby patch of trees. This suggested that the bathroom window was the point of entry. The family and local residents were devastated, and despite a strong motivation to try and find the suspect, no strong leads ever came through. With it being the 1980s, forensic analysis was still in its junior years. And so, with no theoretical suspects identified and all avenues of biological matching exhausted, the likelihood of solving this crime fast diminished. With enthusiasm to maybe solve this case one day in the future, police along with forensic analysts gathered up pieces of evidence and the crime scene and stored them all in a container, should any new technologies in the future help to one day solve this case. And with that, the case went cold. Two years later, in 1983, law enforcement decided to look back at the case. Several years prior, while Sylvia was still alive, the Canadian Mounted Police were pioneering a new technology called alternate light sourcing. They were making use of argon ion lasers, but the technology was expensive, required bulky machines, and were impractical for use at crime scenes, so it was limited to the crime lab. By the time 1983 had come along, however, portable lasers began to appear in the marketplace. Their usefulness was still limited mostly to a single colour of light, but forensics were getting by. That's when investigators using alternate light source determined that a piece of the rug taken near the body contained potential foreign material. And that's why, 12 years later, in 1995, when the service was applicable, the rug was sent to the Central Bureau of Investigations for testing. It took some time for a DNA profile to be developed, but by the year 2000, the CBI had created a full profile matching the DNA that was found on the rug. This, however, didn't lead to any suspect. There was no one on the state's or the nation's DNA database with a matching profile. And this is where we see our biggest jump to the story. Because it wasn't until several years later when a prompt to Sylvia's case motivated an analyst to take that sequenced DNA and upload it to two different general open source websites, Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. Both of these sites are a lot more simple than what I've just said. Essentially, they give you a DNA kit, you give them back your DNA, and they then match that to what they've got in the database to see if you have any missing family. The new technology and idea, called genetic geology, is bold and open. Investigators are hoping to use the mysterious suspect's DNA with the online database in hopes to find a match. A different way of connecting a suspect to the traditional US national DNA database. And they got a match. The only problem was the DNA matched an entire family tree with over 3,300 people. I guess that's a little better than an entire country, right? Investigators got to work on the case straight away. But with so many possible suspects spanning almost every state in America, they had a lot of work to do. And it took a huge amount of effort to narrow down the suspect to just one. The background work required to this new kind of identification technology is extensive. And it includes using the matching DNA to look over all sorts of newspapers and public records, finding out about those people and who they're related to, and where they're from, and where they lived. And eventually all that work in time looked like it was going to pay off, because of the 3,300 suspects, they managed to whittle down to just one. That one set of DNA belonged to a man, and his name was David Anderson. David Anderson seems to have lived in the area of Colorado back in 1981, so the geography matched too. And the only sitch was that he'd moved by then. This would take detectives all the way over to Nebraska. Okay, fine, it's only one state away. But on January 17th, 2021, detectives would drive to Nebraska to the property of David Anderson. They had to be careful though, because technically he was still an innocent man, and they also didn't want to alert his suspicions to what they were trying to do. They gathered evidence of the property using Google Maps and information from the local council, and after camping in their vehicle for 2 days, watched David put his usual trash into the bin. They retrieved the bin bag and its contents, and in its contents they would find 2 empty beer bottles and a can of Coca-Cola Vanilla. And while the beer bottles provided nothing, the Vanilla Coke can was able to provide genetic material. They sent the can in for analysis, and 11 days later, on January 29th, 2021, results from the forensic laboratory came back. The DNA found on the rug from the crime scene in Sylvia's home matched the DNA of the Coke can. The analysis, pretty much confirming that David he was there on the day that Sylvia died. David Anderson was arrested on the 10th of February 2021 at his home in Nebraska. He has since returned to Colorado to face his charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder.
I can't imagine, as a father myself, of a young woman about this age, to have a morning like that.
As the case is so old now, David Anderson will be prosecuted under the laws that were in place back in 1981. This means if convicted, he's likely to be sentenced to life without parole. Not that this means much anymore. David, he is now over 60 years of age. Ironically, to keep this case straightforward, I kept out the fact that in 1983, police thought they'd solved this case, when a drifter named Otis Elwood Toole confessed to Sylvia's murder. However, like his friend Henry Lee Lucas, Otis falsely confessed to several crimes at the time, and officials ultimately dropped the charge against him. And there we have it, 40 years. I wonder how long it took for him to feel safe that he was never going to be caught. How many years it took him until he stopped looking over his shoulder. It's fair to say that his crime didn't make him feel too guilty. I'm sure if he did, then he would have handed himself in years ago. So next time any of you out there that are thinking about committing a crime, maybe don't just think about how you might get caught now. You're going to have to pull out a crystal ball and think how you may get caught in 40 years too. Thank you so much for watching another espresso case of mine today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe, maybe even leave a like and drop a comment. A bit of a different case today, but I thought it was really interesting nevertheless. What did you think of it? Thanks once again folks, take it easy and look after each other, and I'll be seeing you real soon in the next one. Until then though, goodbye.